Boa tarde.
Deixa eu só apresentar o Max. O Max Fischer foi finalista do Prêmio Pulitzer em 2019 com uma reportagem coletiva sobre as redes sociais e é autor do livro A Máquina do Caos, como as redes sociais reprogramaram nossa mente e o nosso mundo. Eu acho que a Malu Gaspar dispensa apresentações. Quem não sabe quem ela é e a importância dela nem talvez deveria estar aqui, mas eu vou fazer a apresentação. Ela é colunista do jornal O Globo, autora dos livros Tudo ou Nada, Eike Batista e a Verdadeira História do Grupo X, e a organização A Odebrecht e o esquema de corrupção que chocou o mundo. Os dois vão conversar então sobre tecnologia e mídia e nos ajudar a entender os riscos que as mídias digitais apresentam e como elas podem afetar a nossa forma de pensar e agir. E claro, o que a gente nos interessa aqui é o impacto na democracia. Malu, vocês têm 40 minutos.
Easy. Bom, gente, é um prazer estar aqui com todos vocês. Vou falar em inglês com o Max, mas não estava programada para falar inglês. Achei que eu ia falar em português, eu ia traduzir para ele. Então, vocês relevem eventuais erros. Eu falo inglês, mas não sou assim, né, essa brastemp. Então, bora. Hi, Max. How are you?
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. I feel a little bit like the Wizard of Oz up on the screen.
Kind of. It's very appropriate, since our theme is social networks. So first I would like to say that without knowing you, I know you're a brave guy because you got into a very, very difficult issue. You entered in a very complicated world and you came from it with a very solid work, showing us some very important things. First one is that the networks and the social networks are reprogramming our minds. So I think you made a very good work on showing us how the algorithms are programming our minds to think in determinate ways. But I got lots of doubts, and this shows us it's a very good book because you come from it, you finish your reading having more doubts than you had before. It's not doubts, you have more, you start thinking about it and start having more and more and more questions. So one of the first questions I would like to put to you is that since the book is very effective in showing us that the social network are reprogramming our world to consume extremist content, and in other words, anti-democratic material, it's hard to process the thing that because you can see the social networks. You leave from your book concluding that the social networks are a threat to our democracy. But the social networks are also a symbol of our democracy. You see, if you have free social networks, you have democracy. In China, you don't have free social networks. In Russia, you don't have. So I was thinking, would you say that democracy itself is kind of an autophagic regime? Like the more it advances, more it creates mechanisms capable of killing it?
What a fascinating question. I think it is certainly true, as you say, that the more open and democratic that our societies become, the easier it is for some of those mechanisms to lead us to pull those democracies down from the inside. Because, of course, there are a lot of people in any society, in any democracy, who maybe don't buy into all of the ideas of democracy, who don't buy into the idea of universal rights, who don't buy into the idea of universal protections. And the more democracy you have, the more those people can be empowered to vote for those ideas and to vote for things that we might call autocracy. I think you make a really important point about how social media is both a thing that can and has upheld our democracies and also something that is empowering and accelerating the forces pulling it down. And there's a separation that I try to make whenever I talk about social media, because I think it's easy to see the good and the bad of social media and say, well, they're entangled and we have to take the one with the other. But the idea of a purely open, neutral social platform is very different from what we actually have in social media. Very early on in the social media era, we had platforms that actually were just neutral expressions of whatever the users wanted to post on them. And they were very democratic. And they had all these effects all over the world where people who were not empowered to speak were suddenly empowered to speak, where you could get information from places that you couldn't get it before. We all remember the Arab Spring protests in 2011 and the influx of social platforms and what it allowed to happen in those societies. But social media platforms, as we experience them today, are far from neutral. The social media companies, which are the largest companies in the world by the size of their market capitalization, worth over, in many cases, over $1 trillion, have by far the most sophisticated software of any privately owned company in the world. They have all of the top artificial intelligence programs in the world. And these people are all dedicated to one task, which is designing algorithms, designing interfaces that are meant to manipulate us and manipulate how we feel and what we think in order to get us to spend more time on the platforms so that they can sell us more ads. And these systems are so sophisticated that even the people who are running them can't tell you how they work. And I know this from having talked to many people who work at the companies, including people who left the companies and discussed over what they were doing and who developed and worked on these algorithms. They say that these algorithms in these systems that determine what you see on the platforms and determine your experience are self-learning and self-teaching. And what that means is that the companies set them up and they give them a goal. They say, we want you to do whatever it will take to get more people to spend more time on the platforms. And importantly, also to get them to post things on the platforms that will encourage them and other users to spend more time online. And do whatever it takes and teach and iterate off of the billions and trillions of data points that these platforms get from every time someone interacts on it. The platforms learn a little bit more about human nature and how to exploit and manipulate it. And the effect has been that these platforms now give us a wildly distorted view of the world, a wildly distorted view of what even the people in our own community think, in a way that is meant to be addictive and that does have a specific neurological effect on your brain that is physically addictive, like going to a casino, like taking a drug, and it alters your cognition, it alters your perception. And that because that is happening to billions of people at scale, and because the platforms tend to push us towards the same emotions, both feeling the same emotions and expressing the same emotions over and over, that has an enormous effect on our politics, on our society. And anyone who has spent time online could see this. You could feel it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing we learned from the book that most of social media companies and all these algorithms you describe, they take the readers and the users to the right. You have a whole part of the book which is which goes on Brazil. It's based on your trip to Brazil, and you conclude that the YouTube, for example, pushes people to the right. And I got very intrigued by that because I understood that all these mechanisms of engagement, outrage, and all these kinds of triggers the algorithms have, they are designed to make us feel things more intense. So why is it? It's right, more intense, more intrinsic to human nature? Human nature is right. It's right wing. I couldn't understand how it pushes us to right. You have all these identitarian movements that are very strong on social media. You have left-wing movements that are very strong on social media. But from what I learned from your book, the right-wing movements, the right extremists, they are more prevalent in the social media. So why is that?
It's a fascinating question, and it's one of the questions I spent the most time on in working on this book, because there are so many studies and research experiments that have reached this finding, that have shown over and over again that all of the social platforms tend to promote right-wing and especially far-right views and opinions and attitudes more than others. And remember the thing I said about how no one knows how these algorithms work. So at first, it was kind of a mystery why that was. I mean, everyone knew it was happening, but there was this big question of why are the systems promoting these more than others? And I should note that it's not just that the platforms will pull you to the right or lead you to far right ideas. Whatever your identity is, and whether that the identity you hold strongest is a political one, whether it's left wing or right wing, if it's a religious identity, if it's one that's tied to nationality or to race, social media will make you feel that more intensely. It will feed that identity back to you in a stronger and stronger form. So if you are someone who identifies as very left wing, the platform won't lead you to the right, it will lead you further to the left. And it increases that sense of polarization and identity regardless of where you are. But there is still this question of why is it that right-wing and far-right views get such a bigger boost, and especially that far-right movements and causes that are very small and not that intense and not that large before they get to social media, when they get to the social platforms, become huge. So why is that? And you hinted at the answer, which is that this sense of, you could call it identitarian, a sense of us versus them gets promoted on these platforms more than almost anything else. One of the things that
doesn't the left wing, the far left doesn't have the same effect on people?
So yes and no. Obviously, if you feel very strongly about left versus right, then yes, it will make you feel more of a sense of that left versus right conflict. However, the sense of an us versus them, that my social group, my identity is besieged by other social groups that are inherently antagonistic to mine, it tends to make people feel a sense of their own identity, again, race, religion, nationality, whatever it is, much more intensely. And that sense of it's all about my social group having to fight against and dominate other social groups, and other social groups are bad, is one that is much more innately tied to right-wing politics worldwide. Right-wing politics worldwide tend to be, in the United States, it's white nationalism. In India, it's Hindu nationalism. I reported from Myanmar, where it was Buddhist nationalism. These all tend to be very right-wing ideologies that say it's all about promoting the dominant group because minorities, immigrants, refugees, outsiders are a threat to us. And that the reason that that emotion gets so heavily promoted on social platforms is because, and again, you hinted at this, it is something that is innate in us. It's not one of our better traits as a species, as humans. It's, I think, one of our most destructive tendencies, but it is something that we feel when it is activated very emotionally, and it can be very, very intense. And the social platforms learned to tap into this. They learned to show us exactly the kinds of posts and content that will tell us to activate our identity, that will tell us that we're under threat. And you see this even with, for example, mom groups. The whole genesis of the anti-vaccine movement online, which blew up on the internet around 2014, 2015, was social platforms pushing posts and groups to mothers, telling them your kids are under threat from a global conspiracy by George Soros, by refugees, by Jews, by whoever it was, to give them bad vaccines for whatever, for profit, to control them. And this is something that activates a sense of identity. If you're a young mother and the internet is telling you your kids are under threat, mothers are under threat, that makes you feel that sense of your identity as a mom much more strongly. And it makes you want to fight back against that vaccine cabal that is threatening you. So this identity, when it gets activated, makes you want to be very, very active in expressing that identity and protecting it. And the social platforms love this, because this effect makes you want to post online. If you're a mom who has been fed a lot of anti-vaccine propaganda online, it makes you very active in mom groups. If you are a white nationalist in the United States who has been fed lots of videos on YouTube telling you that whites are under threat from refugees and minorities, it makes you want to become very active on YouTube in this community, because you feel this sense of having to rally on behalf of us against them. And one of the terrible ironies is that all of the people in the social media companies are left-wing. They don't like these ideas. They don't want to promote them, but they built systems that promoted them, and then they were too greedy to turn it off.
So it's kind of the algorithm is an independent being.
Exactly.
Some entity which nobody controls.
Yes, it's scary. I think it's scary.
That's funny and tragic. So, war is the war we are facing now, Israel against Hamas. I came here thinking of it. It might be the biggest or the most recent important laboratory of what you designed in your book. And I would like, and I know you've been covering it as a journalist, so I would like to know how do you perceive the way people are behaving in social media concerning to war? Because we can see there very extremist content material on the side of Hamas, but also on Israel's side. Lots of fake news. So I wonder if you have seen some comparison. Any proof of what you've already learned or discovered, or on the contrary, something that is like confronting what you've discovered. What are you seeing in social media about war that proves your thesis?
So I have been thinking a lot about how different it is to follow this conflict between Israel and Hamas on social media today than it was to follow the last major conflict between Israel and Hamas 9 years ago in 2014, which I also covered. In 2014, 9 years ago, social media was not yet what we know it to be today. It was just on the verge of becoming the thing that we know now, where it's all determined by algorithms, where what you see is manipulated in order to make you want to spend more time online. It was kind of the last gasp of the old social media that was much more neutral. And in 2014, social media played an enormously positive role, I think, in helping to promote people's understanding of what was happening in Israel and in Gaza at that time. Because to be online in 2014, you were hearing from so many people, especially in Gaza, just regular people who were posting on the social media platforms about what they were seeing and what was happening to them. And it meant that for a lot of people who didn't really know what it was like in Gaza, or had never thought about what it was like in Gaza, for the first time they were seeing it. And for the first time, they were getting a real sense of what this conflict actually looked like, what it felt like, what it was like to be a Gazan, a Palestinian in Gaza, what it was like for the Israelis in southern Israel, where the rockets were. And it really changed, I know in the United States especially, but also globally, it really changed people's perceptions and their attitudes towards this conflict in a way that I think was really productive. And you really started to see, especially in the United States, in Europe, where people are not always as sympathetic to Palestinians, much more of an understanding of what this conflict means to Palestinians. And you saw much more depth and nuance and compassion in how people thought about this conflict, I think because social media was giving them this really positive window into it. But that is not what it is like on social media today. What it is like on social media today to follow this conflict is, first of all, a lot of misinformation. More than that, what you see when you log on to social media is not even news, because the social platforms don't promote news anymore. And they're all very open about this. They say, we don't want to promote news. We don't like promoting news. What they promote are viral posts from people who are outraged on behalf of one side against the other side. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to be outraged. There are a lot of very outrageous things happening there. But the way that that outrage is getting expressed on social media today is not one that is rooted in facts or a nuanced understanding of the conflict. It's, I saw someone else post something that I don't like and I'm mad at them. My yoga teacher posted something on her Instagram that took the wrong side, and now I'm going to get her online. Or it's, you know, people exaggerating, it's people spreading rumors or misinformation that validate their sense of how they feel about the conflict and that hype up and amp up their emotions and spreading that. And it creates much more of a sense of not just one side versus another in Israel and Gaza, but one side versus another in our own societies. And, you know, it's the people who support the Palestinians against the people who support Israel. And the people who support Israel or support the Palestinians are irredeemable and they're monsters and I hate them and all I want to do is yell at them online. And so you don't get any information. All you get is polarization and this sense that an exaggerated, distorted view of whatever is the other side for you to make you hate them as much as possible. And it's truly, I think, some of the worst that social media has ever been for following a major news story, because you don't get any information. And I see it in my daily life. I interact with so many people who are just getting information about the conflict that supports their side and that makes the other side look bad. And I think that that's really harmful because it makes it very hard to humanize the other side. It makes it very hard to understand the conflict in its totality. And that's bad for, I mean, certainly in the United States, where it's very important what our public thinks, because our government is very involved in this conflict. So we want our public to be informed on it so they can pressure our government to play a positive role in it, but that's not what we're getting.
Where are you getting the information you need, besides from your sources, of course, but what are you reading, what are you looking at for when you try to read?
So what am I looking at? I think that traditional news organizations, I think that this is what they're best at, because they have people there, because there are people on the ground who can tell us what's happening, who can talk to doctors at the hospital, who can talk to victims. And I know that's traditionalist, I know, but I think that it's a very good source of information.
Guy. You want vintage social media, vintage media, and everything.
I do. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So that it takes me to something I really want. I think what I really wanted to talk to you is about media, like websites and everything. I'm here in Brazil. I run a blog in the Globo newspaper, jornal O Globo, and as everybody, we are always struggling with metrics and audience and everything, and on this balance of how producing relevant news and having engagement. So, because these not always come together, and we've learned this in the elections, as you learned this in the elections in the United States too. It's a paradox, a very difficult paradox. Because while we think, for example, in the United States was Trump, here Bolsonaro, you should cover Bolsonaro, you should cover Trump, we noticed that they generated a lot of engagement, and then you would cover more and more and more, and there is no discussion without any good and reasonable answer of how much legacy media has boosted Trump, Bolsonaro, and all this kind of stuff. And this is still true. For example, the story I ran today in the blog was the most seen, the most viewed story I put in my blog this week, and it was about Bolsonaro. So it is still true. So I wonder if how do you? I don't know if you know the answer because it's the $1 million question. But I wanted you to, as you also work in the media, you're on a website right now. I think you're always facing this kind of question and dilemma. So how do you think can we get off from this trap or if we can't get off of this trap, we're trapped in it and there's no solution. I mean, how do you see this issue?
It's a good question. And we are all of us in journalism and the media, we are adjusting to what has been another round of very significant changes in what drives audience over the last year, after many years of it changing over and over again. And we are, I think, getting off of a treadmill maybe that was run by the social media companies. And I don't think that this is the most important impact of social media. I don't want to make it sound like I have a grudge against social media platforms because of what they did to the news media. In some ways, the disruption of the advertising market was necessary, maybe even productive. But one big impact that it has had is that social media platforms are able to drive so much traffic to news sites, is that it was training all of us in the news media to chase that traffic. And of course, we were complicit in that. I don't want to push all the blame onto the social media companies, because that traffic was elusive. Because as reporters, we want people to read our stories. That's why we write it, right? We want to reach people because we think what we're doing has social value. And if we learned that tweaking a little bit what you cover or tweaking your headline a little bit would make it go viral on Facebook or on Twitter or on Reddit, and you could reach so many more people, I don't think that that means that we were twisting the journalism. I think that we were all still doing what we thought was good, honest, productive work. But if you could cover 5 different things, and one of those things you thought might go viral on Facebook, maybe you cover that one instead of the others, and that has an impact. And that era is ending now. For better or for worse, the social media companies have all decided in the last year that they no longer want to direct traffic to news sites. And they've been very open about this. The top people at Facebook and at Twitter have said, we don't want to promote news anymore. And sure enough, if you go to those platforms, you will not see news links. And I happen to think that this is enormously destructive for society, because people on those platforms still want to consume news. They still want to know what's going on in the world. So now the platforms, instead of showing them links from reputable news sites like Globo, is showing them misinformation and rumors, because those things are more viral. But putting that aside, the effect for us is that there's less traffic for us to get, which means there are fewer ads that we can sell against any given article, which means that the news business is going to get tougher. But I think the good news is that it's a little bit freeing. If there's no more social traffic to chase, if there's no more temptation to chase that traffic from
There's
Facebook,
always going to be social traffic to chase.
But there's so much less. There's so much less. It's dropping by like 95%. It doesn't, I in my experience, and
how
you, of course,
social media.
Yeah, I mean, well, you have to, that's the question that we're all facing, right? Is how do you get audience without that? Well, but I think, but I do think that the answer a lot of us are finding is that maybe you don't get as many readers now as you used to, because you can't get that Facebook wave of traffic, but that you can get a smaller number of dedicated readers by the things that we did before social media, which is trying to build a relationship with your audience that will get a small number of people to come back over and over again. And those people will pay a subscription because they care more than someone who came in off of Facebook. And I think that's why so many media companies are now switching to a paywall, switching to a subscription-only model that doesn't work for everyone, but I think has proven successful for a lot of media organizations.
Yeah, let's see. I'm not sure of it. Well, in a recent interview to Globo, you said something that caught my attention. The attack to the Brazilian democracy is crucial to understand the impact of social media. It's the historic fact most explicit for that, and more than the January 6th Capitolian invasion. I don't know how to call that. So I would like to know, why do you think so? Why do you think Brazilian attack to the democracy, to the buildings of the judiciary, executive, and the Congress, why is it more important and more significant for us to understand the impact of social media than what happened in the United States?
So I want to be careful in how I answer this because while I have reported in Brazil a few times, of course, I don't know the nuances of Brazilian politics, of the changes in Brazilian society nearly as well as you were, I'm sure, everyone in the audience. But the impression that I got when I first started reporting on social media's impact on politics in Brazil right after Bolsonaro's election is that in many ways, Brazil, in its experience with the relationship between social media and politics, is kind of 2 or 3 years in the future from where the rest of us are going. And one of the reasons that I think that is the role, and you mentioned this, the role of YouTube in the 2018 elections was so significant, and I think was quite scary in how much that platform was able to distort people's perceptions of politics and was able to drive people in their political attitudes towards changing their views in a way that we were only just starting to see in places like the United States and in Europe, but is now starting to become much more evident. And I think January 8th was an example of that too, because January 6th had a lot of causes in the United States, and a lot of those were on social media, and social media building up over the course of several months specific conspiracies and specific groups that promoted we call it the Capitol riot, that promoted what happened on January 6th, and that took these from very small fringe ideas to much larger ideas. However, there were also a lot of people who were pushing it, like Donald Trump, like people in American politics who were really promoting this and had a huge role in this. And that was why the January 6th riots were so large. And I understand this was happening in Brazil too, of course, but I think it was not quite at the same scale. And something that I think really struck me about January 8th was how quickly social platforms were able to spin this up. And I think you saw it in how quickly the riots and the movements behind the riots dissipated. And this is really a hallmark of things that emerge that are driven by social media, is that you will go from not exactly zero, of course, because I know this sentiment had been there for a while, but we'll go from a very low level and then all of a sudden explode into the real world and then all of a sudden disappear, because it's just all dependent on what the algorithms of these platforms are pushing, where all of a sudden they'll decide to promote this conspiracy and to promote posts telling people to go out on the streets. And then a week later, it'll switch to something else and it'll start promoting something else. And then we've seen this over and over since then, these riots and big movements that will explode out of nowhere someplace and then quickly dissipate.
So we are trendy.
You were trendy. That's right.
We were trendy. I would have to ask people here if anybody has questions for Max.
No. No. Aqui, ali, lá no final. People are going to ask you some easier questions.
Hard questions, please.
I'm not sure if this is hard, but let me ask you this question. You just mentioned that Brazil is ahead in terms of the problems faced by the social media. But could you explain other countries also and what does this represent in the world?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I actually first started reporting on social media because I was seeing such a consistent set of trends in so many different countries. Most of my professional background was as a foreign correspondent for newspapers. So I was covering things like wars, international diplomacy, and I never took the internet seriously. I always thought it's just websites, it's just smartphone apps. How important could it really be? How much influence could it really have? And I started to take it more seriously, not even with the election of Donald Trump, because that was something that led a lot of Americans to start to ask, did social media play some role in this? Was it misinformation? Was it far-right groups getting promoted on the platforms? Even after that, I didn't take it seriously. It wasn't until I went to Myanmar in late 2017 to cover the genocide that was then unfolding there. There was a genocide that was being perpetrated against a Muslim minority in that country that I was there to cover. And I started hearing when I was there, everybody was talking to me about social media. I never brought it up because, again, I didn't take it seriously. But everybody who I talked to, whether they were extremists who were participating in the genocide, or they were human rights groups who were monitoring it, or they were politicians or reporters, everybody was telling me social media is having an enormous impact on leading people to the ideas and the sentiments and the feelings that are promoting this act of mass uprising to attack this minority group. And it was after that I started to notice everywhere I traveled, I would see a very, very similar set of patterns. And it plays out differently in poorer countries like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, where you would see the effect mostly in social platforms, exacerbating racial or religious or national divisions, but that would lead people to have this hate and fear and mistrust of the other side that they would then feel compelled to go act on. And if I was in richer countries like the United States or Brazil or Germany or France, where it would lead to something that initially looked different to me, but the closer I looked, started to feel very similar, where it would lead to a lot of people to fear and hate and mistrust minorities or refugees or foreigners or conspiracies about vaccines or things like that. And that would then lead them to, not so differently from people in, say, Sri Lanka or Myanmar, to say, we can't trust the authorities. We have to take matters in our own hands. We have to promote a cause that will fight this threat to our society. And in countries like Brazil and the United States, that's manifested sometimes in vigilante groups that will commit violence. And I reported on quite a bit of that, but sometimes will lead people to vote for far-right causes or to shift their politics towards the far right. And once I saw the parallels between how that was playing out in richer countries and in poorer countries, I really started to notice it everywhere. And once I started to notice that, every time I would go to a country to report on something that was happening there, I would do a story about social media's impact. And every time the pattern seemed to be the same in terms of the kinds of things that were promoted on the platform and then the effects that that would have on society. And I think it's just getting worse.
Well, we have one more question.
So hi, I'm Camila Sano from a Brazilian human rights organization, Conectas. I wanted to ask you about social media and elections, because we know next year, 2024, we have like dozens of elections across the world and some very crucial that will, of course, impact also in Brazil. We are already thinking about, we have local elections next year in Brazil, but our next general elections in 2026. So, for instance, in next year, of course, US, but then also in South Africa, India, El Salvador, and countries that we've been, for instance, discussing this year with Argentinian partners of Conectas on their elections. No, there are very few days ahead. They are going to have a very important election on everything we are discussing here is at stake. And they mentioned, and we asked all the time, well, okay, let's talk about social media and regulation and how much misinformation and disinformation is impacting on the elections and the defense of democracy. And said, well, it's not that thing. So we thought, okay, maybe they are Brazil 2018 and not what we had in last year in our last elections. So if you can talk more about social media and elections, and if you have any kind of, key points to raise on how we should think specifically on the use of social media in electoral period, but also to attack electoral systems and kind of these pillars of one of our election and democracy pillars as well. Thank you.
So it's a great question. I think the election coming up that I am most concerned about in terms of social media's role, and that I think maybe like Brazil in the last few years could be a predictor for how things could play out globally is India's. Not just because the elections in India, of course, are extremely important, but because the government there and groups allied with the government have become very aggressive about learning how to manipulate social media in a way that we have not seen in the past from major political parties. This is coming in the form of spreading false information, of spreading polarizing information, spreading incitement that will get people very excited about a sense of Hindu nationalism that will make them then want to go out and vote for the ruling party, the BJP, but will also have, very dangerous consequences for Muslim communities and other minorities in the country. They set up large operations, professionalized operations to spread this content in a really aggressive way. And the government of India and groups allied with that government have also become very aggressive about using their power to pressure the social media companies, and Facebook especially, and the platforms owned by Facebook, which of course also includes Instagram and WhatsApp, have really been captured by the BJP. There are a number of former BJP officials who now work in senior positions in Facebook's India and South Asia offices and are really pressuring what's on the platform and what the platform moderates and what it doesn't. India's been very aggressive in the past about blocking the platforms, which the companies are extremely responsive to because they don't want to lose that ad money. They don't want to lose that market share. And they are very pliant in tilting what is on the platforms in order to avoid that sort of regulation. So that's a model that really concerns me because I think we are going to see more governments getting more aggressive about this and learning how to turn the platforms to their ends. But that said, there are also positive models. I'm sure that from your work, you were familiar with Kenya and the Kenyan government and NGOs in Kenya, when they had their election a couple of years ago, were very, very effective at setting up not just fact-checking shops, but setting up operations to proactively identify viral misinformation and viral incitement that was spreading on the platforms and to try to counteract it before it could spread too much, and to try to work with the platforms or to pressure the platforms to curb this bad and harmful content before it could spread too much, and to try to reach people in the country, to reach the electorate with good information that would counter the bad information that was being spread. And I think it had a pretty positive impact at curbing the reach of the platforms and curbing the harm that they caused. At the same time, we also see countries like Australia and Canada that are trying to impose regulations on social media, and the social media companies are fighting back very aggressively. And that is also something that worries me, because maybe that you saw this, that about a year ago, maybe it was a year and a half ago, when Australia was going to pass some regulations on social media companies that would require them to pay kind of a tax to news companies, Facebook blocked all news in the platform throughout Australia for a few weeks, and it was very harmful. There were people in towns where natural disasters were hitting, and they couldn't get good information because government services were blocked from posting on the platform about what were happening. People couldn't reach rape crisis centers that used Facebook to reach people, and they're doing the same thing now in Canada, and they are just using their control of news as a weapon against governments to try to coerce them against passing regulations. And again, I think that's going to get worse as the big American social media companies kind of give up any pretense of being the good guys and give up any pretense of being for free flow of information, for being for freedom of speech, and are become more open about just being about their bottom line and their commercial interests, no matter what it does to the rest of us.
Carol, mais alguma? Ok.
Hi.
Cadê?
Hi. Thank you for doing this. I'm Daniela Chiarete. I'm a journalist from Valor Econômico, and it's great to hear you and Malu. And I have, if I may, I have two questions. One is on Brexit. if you think that Brexit, it was the start of this movement and the role of social media on that. And the second one is on climate. How do you think that, because there is a lot of misinformation on climate issues, and how do you see this struggle in such a urgent matter in the world nowadays? Thank you.
Sure. So Brexit is a good question, because I think that was maybe the first time that we started to hear about the idea that social media had played a role in promoting misinformation in a way that led to a significant political change. I do think that social media probably did not lead to Brexit. I think it probably exacerbated people's opinions on it, and especially people who had fear of refugees and fear of migrants. I think that got driven up a little bit by social media, because we know it does that. But at the same time, popular attitudes towards Brexit had been pretty stable in the country for a while leading up to the Brexit vote, and that extended back to before the period in 2014, 2015, when the social media platforms really became what we know them to be today. So I think just the polling data suggests that if social media had not existed, probably Britain would have voted for Brexit anyway. But I think that it was a kind of early warning sign where we could start to see little hints of what social media was going to start doing in all of our societies. On climate, I think that it really depends on what country we're talking about and what issue we are talking about, because social media doesn't necessarily promote misinformation as a matter of course. There's no reason that Twitter or Facebook or YouTube would innately prefer false information to good information. The only reason that those social platforms would promote misinformation is if the algorithms conclude that misinformation will do a better job of getting you to be engaged on the platforms because it's an issue that is very politically polarized. So it's only, I think, in that context, if there's a specific climate issue that people are really polarized around politically, then I think in those cases, it's likely the platforms are going to promote misinformation. And of course, we've seen that happen already if there's a large disaster or there's a large wildfire. If it's in a politically sensitive case, or it's a case where maybe two major parties are fighting about what to do about it, the platforms will promote misinformation on it. But I think that climate is not something that innately social media is necessarily harmful for, as much as other issues like migration or wars or other conflicts.
I think she's saying that because in Brazil, climate changes and Amazon and everything, it polarizes also the public debate. So maybe that's why she's asking the question like this. So, acabou, Carol? Acabou. I bet people would have lots of questions to do. And I have my own questions I'm going to send you by mail and give you some work, because I don't want to waste them. I did a lot of questions here. So
great.
Maybe
I can't wait.
Maybe I'm going to send you the questions by mail. And so I thank you a lot for this time you had with us. And quer falar alguma coisa, Ju?
Eu vou falar em português, então ele não vai entender. Então a gente já pode
so thank you very much and see you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, so much.